The watch buzzed on the kitchen counter at 9:47 on a Tuesday night, and a man's voice, not mine, said, "I miss you already," into an empty room. My name is Jason. I'm 38 years old. I sell industrial packaging equipment for a living. And until that Tuesday, I would have told you, without hesitation, that my marriage was solid. Not perfect. Solid. 10 years with Elena, one daughter, a house with a mortgage I actually understood, a life that looked, from every angle I'd ever bothered to check, exactly like it was supposed to. The watch belonged to Mia. She was 7, and Elena had bought her one of those kids' smartwatches that fall semester. GPS, a few contacts, a two-way call function, so she could reach us from the school bus loop without a phone. It synced notifications to a companion app on my phone, which I'd installed and mostly forgotten about. The way you forget about things that are supposed to just work. I was standing at the counter with a beer I hadn't finished, half watching a message pop up on my screen. Mia's watch. Incoming call. And I almost let it go to nothing, because Mia was asleep down the hall, and I figured the watch had but dialed someone in her sock drawer. Then the little speaker crackled to life on its own, some auto-answer setting Elena had configured months ago and never mentioned, and a man's voice came through clear as anything, warm in a way that had nothing to do with a 7-year-old. "I miss you already," he said. "Tell me you're still thinking about Friday." I stood there with the bottle sweating in my hand, and I didn't move for what felt like a long time. I remember the refrigerator hum. I remember a dish towel hanging crooked on the oven handle, and how strange it was that my eyes fixed on something so small while the floor of my life was quietly giving way underneath me. I remember thinking, absurdly, that I should hang up, as if hanging up could undo what I'd already heard. I want you to understand something about who I was in that moment, before anything else happens in this story. I was a man who had spent 10 years assuming that if something was wrong, I would simply know. I trusted my own instincts the way you trust a smoke detector you've never actually tested. I was about to learn how wrong that assumption was, and how long the truth can sit in a house, waiting for the exact right accident to finally speak. If you are the kind of person who checks the batteries in that smoke detector twice a year, you already understand what I didn't. That trust without verification isn't peace of mind. It's just a longer fuse. I didn't sleep that night. I told myself I'd misheard something, that the call had crossed wires with a stranger's phone, some glitch in a cheap piece of plastic technology that cost $40 on clearance. By morning, I'd almost talked myself into believing it. I even looked up the watch model online at 2 in the morning, searching for anything, a forum post, a support thread, a single stranger's complaint, that would tell me this kind of cross-signal accident actually happened to other families. I didn't find one. I kept looking anyway, because looking felt like doing something, and doing something felt better than lying in the dark with what I already suspected. Elena made coffee the way she always did, humming something under her breath, kissing the top of Mia's head while she packed a lunch. Nothing about her looked like a woman keeping a secret. That was the first thing I didn't understand yet, that people don't look like what they're hiding. They look like Tuesday. I went back 3 years earlier in my head, trying to find the moment things had started to thin out between us, and I couldn't land on one. There wasn't a fight I could point to. There was just a slow subtraction, fewer questions asked at dinner, fewer hands reaching for each other in the dark, a marriage that had quietly become 2 people running a household well. We split chores with the precision of 2 coworkers who respected each other, but had stopped being curious about each other's day. I used to know what she was reading. I realized, standing at that counter, that I couldn't remember the last book on her nightstand. I didn't ask her about the call, not because I didn't want to know, but because some part of me was already afraid of the answer, and asking would have made it real in a way that silence didn't. That week, small things started arranging themselves into a pattern I hadn't been looking for. Elena took a phone call in the garage with the door pulled shut, laughing at something, and when I walked in to grab a tool, she ended the call so fast the screen was still lit when she slid it into her back pocket. She'd started going to a Thursday night pottery class that hadn't existed 2 months earlier, and she came home from it smelling like a perfume I didn't recognize, sweeter than anything in our bathroom cabinet. She'd also started running later on those nights. 9:15 became 9:45 became, once, almost 11, with an explanation about a kiln timer that I nodded along to without really hearing. I noticed. I filed it under nothing. I had a Q3 sales target to hit and a flight to Cincinnati on Thursday and a version of myself that had learned, over 10 years, to file almost everything under nothing rather than sit with the discomfort of asking a real question and getting a real answer. That was the job I'd unofficially assigned myself in this marriage. The one who didn't make waves, who kept things running, who mistook his own silence for strength. She would tell me, much later, that she used to watch me not ask, and that some small, ugly part of her was grateful for it every single time. Looking back now, that was the moment I should have asked the question I kept avoiding. I called it a coincidence then. I wouldn't call it that anymore. I want to stop here for a second. If you've ever caught a single loose thread on a sweater you loved and told yourself it would be fine if you just didn't pull it, you already know exactly what that week felt like. Friday came. The Friday the man on the watch had asked about. Elena told me she was meeting her sister for dinner in Columbus and would be back late. I said okay. I didn't ask which restaurant. I didn't think about it again until 3 days later. I should have. I remember I even offered to pick something up for her on my way home, some small domestic kindness, and she said not to bother, she'd grab something in the city. I made her a plate anyway and left it in the fridge. She never mentioned it. I found it Sunday, untouched, and told myself she'd just forgotten. My mother-in-law called on Sunday asking if Elena had liked the birthday gift she'd sent her sister, Priya, the week before, the one Elena had supposedly been having dinner with on Friday night. Priya had been at a work conference in Chicago all weekend. I stood in the driveway holding the phone and felt something in my chest go very still, the specific stillness that comes right before a truth you already suspect finally has a name. I didn't confront her. I told myself I needed more than a scheduling contradiction from a 70-year-old woman who sometimes mixed up her days. But I started watching in a different way after that. Not suspicious exactly, just awake, in a house where I'd been sleepwalking for longer than I wanted to admit. I started noticing what time she left in the morning versus what time her calendar said her first meeting started. I started noticing that her gym bag, which used to smell like chlorine, had stopped smelling like anything at all, like it wasn't being used, like it was a prop. Our neighbor's boy, not ours, the kid next door, Tyler, 16, and always around mowing lawns for cash, mentioned to me while I was getting the mail that he'd seen Elena's car parked outside the Marriott off Route 9 a bunch of times, said it like it was nothing, like he was making conversation about weather. I thanked him and went inside and didn't tell him what he'd just done to my Sunday. I stood in the front hallway for a long moment afterward, keys still in my hand, listening to Mia's cartoons drifting from the living room. And I remember thinking that a 16-year-old with a lawnmower had just handed me more truth in 11 words than my wife had offered me in 11 days. Mia had her own thread in all of this, one I didn't see clearly until much later. She'd started asking, out of nowhere, why mommy seemed sad sometimes, even when she was smiling, a question with the plain, devastating accuracy that only children manage. I told her mommy was just tired. I didn't know yet that I was lying to my daughter about something I didn't understand myself. She drew a picture that week of our family standing in front of the house, and in it, for the first time I ever remember, Elena's stick figure was standing slightly apart from the rest of us, a small gap of white paper between her hand and mine. I noticed it on the fridge and told myself it meant nothing. Children draw strange things. Elena's behavior kept escalating in ways I kept explaining away. She started keeping her phone face down on every surface, a habit she'd never had before, and once, reaching for it to check the time, she caught my hand moving toward it and said, too quickly, too brightly, "It's dead, don't bother." And it wasn't dead. I saw the screen light up in her purse 20 minutes later. She also started deleting her call log. I only noticed because I went looking for a plumber's number she'd texted me the week before, and the thread with her had simply been wiped clean back 3 weeks, an editing job too careful to be an accident. I didn't ask. I smiled, even though inside I wanted to ask 100 questions. I told myself it was easier this way. It wasn't easier. It was just quieter. 2 nights later, at 11 p.m., my phone buzzed with another notification from Mia's watch app. A missed call this time. No auto answer, just a name I didn't recognize saved in a contact list I hadn't set up. D. I stared at that single letter for a long time before I put the phone face down on my own nightstand, in the exact gesture I'd just watched my wife make 100 times without understanding it. If I had opened that contact list that night instead of 2 weeks later, everything that follows would have gone differently. I lay awake next to her that night, listening to her breathe, wondering if the letter D belonged to someone whose whole name she'd already memorized in her body the way I used to have mine. I started keeping a small notebook in my car, dates, times, the little inconsistencies that on their own meant nothing and together meant everything. I hated myself for it, a grown man tracking his wife's movements like a private investigator in his own driveway. And I did it anyway, because some door in me had already closed and I needed to know what was on the other side of it before I said a single word out loud. I kept the notebook under the driver's seat, beneath an old ice scraper, as if my own car were a place that needed hiding spots now too. There were false leads. I spent 2 days convinced the man's voice belonged to Elena's old college friend Marcus, who'd moved back to Ohio that spring and reconnected with her on social media. I built an entire theory around him, watched his profile, felt sick about it, and then found out through her calendar that the two of them had only ever met once, for coffee, with Mia in tow. A dead end. I felt almost disappointed in myself for how badly I'd wanted it to be him, because Marcus would have been easy. Marcus would have made sense of nothing without breaking anything I didn't already suspect was broken. I remember sitting in the parking lot of his old office building on a lunch break I'd invented an excuse to take, watching a door he wasn't even going to walk through, and understanding for the first time how much of grief arrives before the actual loss does. The real thread was the letter D, and it took me 9 days to connect it to a name. Derek, a project manager Elena had met 8 months earlier when her old design firm brought her in for freelance work on a rebrand. I found his name buried in an old email thread, innocuous, professional, the kind of exchange that gives away nothing on its own. But I also found, in the browser history on our shared laptop, a mistake on her part, or maybe by then she'd stopped being as careful. A search for a hotel loyalty program under an account that wasn't hers, and beneath it, half hidden in the history from weeks earlier, a search for how to know if you're falling out of love with your husband that I read 3 times before I could make myself close the tab. The Marriott off, Route 9. The one Tyler had mentioned without knowing what he was handing me. My own subplot was unraveling alongside hers, though I didn't see the shape of it yet. My brother Danny had been leaning on me for a loan to cover a business debt he hadn't told our parents about, and I'd been quietly bailing him out for months. Another secret circling our family that I hadn't connected to anything until Elena, overhearing one of those calls, snapped at me for always fixing everyone else's problems and never noticing your own house. A sentence that landed strange at the time and made devastating sense 2 weeks later. I wired Danny another $4,000 that same week, distracted, barely reading the transfer confirmation, my mind entirely somewhere else. On a hotel loyalty account, on a folded receipt I hadn't found yet, on a letter D that was slowly becoming a whole person in my imagination. That detail seemed insignificant at the time. It wasn't. I want to stop here for a second, because this is the part of the story people ask me about most. If you've ever built a case against someone you love, one receipt at a time, hoping every single piece will somehow add up to nothing, you already know there's no version of that hope that survives the last piece falling into place. The last piece was a hotel receipt, printed, folded small, tucked into the zipper pocket of a jacket Elena hadn't worn in weeks. Room 214. A date. A name on the card that wasn't mine. I remember unfolding it standing in our bedroom closet, surrounded by her clothes, breathing in the ordinary detergent smell of our life together, and feeling the exact moment that smell stopped meaning safety and started meaning nothing at all. I sat in my car in our own driveway for 40 minutes before I went inside, and when I finally did, I didn't say anything to her that night. I went and sat on the edge of Mia's bed while she slept, listening to her breathe, and I came out of that room a different man than I'd been going in. She thought that receipt was gone for good. It had been sitting 11 inches from her coat for 8 days. I waited until Mia was at her grandmother's for the weekend. I put the receipt, the printed hotel history, and my phone. The recording of that first auto-answered call, which I'd saved without fully understanding why, on the kitchen table between us, and I asked her to sit down. "Who is Derek?" I said. Not a question. A door opening. Elena's face did something I'd never seen it do before. Not shock, exactly. Recognition. Like she'd been rehearsing this exact moment in her head for months, and some part of her was almost relieved it had finally arrived. Her hands went still on the table in a way that told me more than her face did. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Doesn't matter. How long has this been happening?" She didn't reach for a lie. That was the thing that undid me first. She didn't even try. Since March, she said, and her voice cracked on the second word. And then it just came, all of it, fast and unstructured, like something that had been dammed up for so long it didn't know how to arrive slowly. I wasn't looking for this, Jason. I need you to know that. It didn't start as anything. Just tell me the truth. All of it. I need to hear it. She put both hands flat on the table like she needed something solid to hold on to. And then she did something she hadn't done in front of me in years. She really talked. It started at the rebrand kickoff meeting in March. Derek was running the project, and it was nothing, Jason. It was just, he asked me a question nobody had asked me in 2 years. He asked what I wanted to work on next, like my opinion about my own career still mattered to somebody. I went home that night, and I sat in the car in the garage for 20 minutes before I came inside, because I couldn't remember the last time you'd asked me that. Not because you're a bad person. Because I disappeared somewhere around Mia's second birthday, and I don't think either of us noticed exactly when. The first time we crossed a line was a work dinner that ran late. Nothing happened. We just talked for 3 hours in a hotel bar, and I told myself that talking wasn't cheating, that I was allowed to have one person in my life who was curious about me. That's the lie I told myself, over and over, every single time. This doesn't count. This isn't that. I'm not that kind of person. I kept redrawing the line every time I crossed it so I could keep believing I hadn't moved. By April, it was texting every day. By May, it was the first hotel. I told you I was with Priya. I have never in my life felt sicker than I did driving home that night, checking my rearview mirror the whole way like the truth was going to catch up with the car. I stood in Mia's doorway when I got home, and I couldn't look at her drawings on the fridge the next morning. This dumb crayon picture of our family, the three of us holding hands, and I had to leave the kitchen because I couldn't stand next to it. I told myself I'd stop after the first time. Then I told myself I'd stop before summer. Then I told myself I'd stop before Mia's birthday. Every deadline I gave myself, I broke, and every time I broke it I hated myself a little more, and somehow that hatred didn't stop me. It just became something else I was carrying that you couldn't see. There was a night in June I almost told you everything. We were doing dishes and you asked if I was okay, and I opened my mouth to say it. I actually opened my mouth, and then Mia came running and wanting help with a puzzle, and the moment just closed over like water. I told myself that was a sign I wasn't supposed to say it yet. I don't think that's true. I think I just wasn't brave enough, and I let a 7-year-old's puzzle be my excuse. There was another night, later, when you fell asleep on the couch during a movie and I sat there watching you breathe, and I thought about waking you up and confessing everything right then, in the dark, with the TV still going. I didn't. I told myself you needed the rest. I think I just needed one more night of you not knowing. I was so afraid of this exact moment, Jason. Sitting here. And I was more afraid of losing this, of losing you, of losing us, than I let myself admit, which doesn't make any sense. I know it doesn't, because I was the one putting it at risk the entire time. I don't have a version of this that makes me look like anything other than what I am. I'm not going to try to build one. I sat there and let her finish. I didn't interrupt more than once, near the middle, when my voice went and I managed only. How could you let Mia, before it caught in my throat completely, and I had to stop. When she was done, the kitchen was very quiet. My hands had been gripping the edge of the table so hard my knuckles had gone white, and I hadn't noticed until I loosened them. I felt something crack open in my chest that I'd been holding shut for 2 weeks of careful, methodical evidence gathering. And for a moment, I couldn't speak at all. I just sat there, breathing, letting it move through me instead of trying to control it. I need you to leave, I finally said. My voice barely sounded like mine. Not forever. Tonight. I can't be in this house with you tonight. She didn't argue. She packed a bag with her hands shaking and left for her sister's, and I sat alone in a kitchen that had heard more truth in the last hour than it had in the previous 10 years, and I understood, distantly, that whatever came next, we were not going back to what we had been. If you have ever sat in a kitchen after a confession like that one, you know the strange thing nobody warns you about. The silence afterward doesn't feel like relief. It feels like the room itself is still catching its breath. I didn't know it yet, but Derek was about to lose more than he'd ever bargained for the moment his own wife found the same hotel records I had. The divorce took 8 months. Elena didn't fight me on custody in any way that turned ugly. We built something workable, imperfect, functional, The kind of arrangement two people manage when they've decided not to let their worst months define every year afterward for their daughter's sake. There were still hard days. There was a mediation session where she cried so hard she couldn't finish a sentence, and I remember feeling, against every instinct I had left, an old reflex to reach across the table and comfort her, and stopping myself, because that reflex belonged to a marriage that didn't exist anymore. Derek's marriage didn't survive the year. His wife found out 3 months after mine did, through a mutual friend who worked at the same firm, and the fallout cost him his position on the rebrand account entirely. The client, coincidentally a company I'd done business with for years, quietly requested a different project lead. I didn't orchestrate that. I didn't need to. Some things simply catch up with a person on their own schedule. I heard, secondhand, that he moved 2 states away that winter. I felt nothing when I heard it. That absence of feeling surprised me more than anger would have. Elena lost something too, something harder to put a price on. Her sister Priya, the one she'd used as a cover story more than once, found out how her name had been used and pulled back from her for the better part of a year. A closeness that had existed for 35 years, gone quiet almost overnight. When Elena finally tried to explain herself to her own mother, she didn't get the forgiveness she was hoping for. She got a long silence on the phone, and then a sentence Elena repeated to me once, months later, without asking for my sympathy. "I don't recognize the choices you made." That sat with her longer than anything I ever said to her. I moved into a smaller house 11 minutes from Mia's school. I put a bookshelf where a television used to go. I started running again, something I hadn't done since college, and I noticed, somewhere around month 5, that I was sleeping through the night without waking up at 3 in the morning replaying a kitchen conversation on a loop. I started cooking real meals again too, for just the 2 of us on my custody weeks, and Mia started keeping a running list on the fridge of dinners she wanted me to make again. A small, ordinary thing that meant more to me than almost anything else that year. A year after the divorce was final, I met Claire at a parent pickup line. Of all places, her son was in Mia's class. We started with small talk about school fundraisers and ended up, 6 months later, sharing dinner 3 times a week. Easy in a way I'd forgotten a relationship could be. I wasn't looking for her. I think that's exactly why it worked. With Claire, I found myself doing the thing I'd never learned to do with Elena. Actually asking, out loud, at the end of a long day, what she wanted. Not assuming I already knew. I could have stayed angry at Elena for a long time. Some part of me wanted to, for a while. Anger felt like it had somewhere to go, like it was doing something. I chose not to stay there. That was the only revenge that mattered, if you want to call it that. I'd call it something closer to self-respect. Mia still wears that watch, though we've turned the auto-answer feature off completely now. An easy fix in hindsight for something that once tore my whole life open by accident. She asked me once, months after everything had settled, why Mommy and I don't live together anymore. And I told her the truth in the smallest words I could find. That sometimes grown-ups make choices that break something important, and that it wasn't anything she did, and that both her parents loved her exactly the same as before. She thought about it for a second and said, "Okay," and went back to her cereal, the way only a child can fully accept an answer and move on from it in the same breath. I recognized myself again somewhere along the way, not the man I was before that Tuesday night, but someone steadier, someone who no longer mistakes a quiet house for a peaceful one. The weight I'd carried for 10 years without fully noticing it was gone, and I only really felt its absence the morning I realized I hadn't thought about that hotel receipt in weeks. I braced myself for a much longer war than the one I got. Instead, somewhere in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, almost 2 years later, I noticed I felt lighter than I had in a very long time, and I hadn't announced it to anyone. I'd simply noticed, the way you notice weather has changed, that the weight was gone. What made this story painful wasn't the affair itself. It was how ordinary the years leading up to it were, on both sides. Jason's mistake wasn't a single dramatic failure. It was 10 years of small, reasonable-seeming choices to not ask the harder question, each one easy to justify in the moment, each one compounding into a marriage run entirely on assumption. He filed real signals under nothing, not because he was careless, but because he'd built an identity around being the steady one, the fixer, the man who didn't need to ask, and asking would have meant admitting that identity had a crack in it. The loan to his brother is a small but telling detail here. A man so practiced at absorbing other people's problems that he'd stopped noticing the one growing in his own kitchen. Elena's account is harder to sit with because it resists a clean villain narrative without ever excusing what she did. She didn't fall into the affair. She made a long series of small, deliberate choices to keep redrawing a line so she could keep crossing it. But underneath that is a real and common collapse. A woman who quietly stopped existing as anything but a household function and who found, in someone else's curiosity about her, a version of herself she thought she'd lost. That explains her behavior. It does not make Jason or Mia collateral damage she was owed. The turning point that actually mattered wasn't the watch. The watch only revealed a fracture that was already structurally complete. The real turning point was months earlier, the night at the sink when Elena almost told the truth and let a child's puzzle close the door instead. That was the last moment either of them could have chosen honesty over inertia, and neither of them took it. The second near miss, the night on the couch, watching him sleep, matters just as much because it shows the confession wasn't a single failed opportunity, but a pattern she kept repeating, each time telling herself the timing was wrong rather than admitting the courage was missing. What lingers longest isn't the betrayal. It's the cost that spread outward from it, to a sister, a mother, a marriage that wasn't even Jason's. Betrayal rarely stays contained to the two people who committed it.